Welcome to our next session. To this session, we'll be having a panel called Governing the Data Revolution. Our own Dr. David Jaffray of MD Anderson will be hosting the panel. He is both the Chief Digital Officer and the Chief Technology Officer of MD Anderson. He also has faculty appointments as a professor of radiation and physics with a joint appointment in imaging physics. At this point, David, thank you for being here and take over.
Thanks, Angela. Pleasure to be here and to talk about something that I'm very passionate about, which is figuring out how we better govern our data. There's so much data now from so many sources. How we govern it, we believe, is essential to make sure we extract as much value as possible. And so we're going to talk about data governance technologies today with the panel, and we have a great number of participants with all kinds of perspectives. I have a number of people who've contributed to this talk, and different organizations have forming perspectives over the years, and they're listed here. We're in an environment now where there's an emerging thing called the data economy. The process of generating data through lives lived has turned into something of great value. It helps us personalize our experience on an online fashion. It can even think about helping personalize our healthcare. And is really from the perspective of the recording of information derived from personal existence, your life record, the creation of true personal data capital, owned, controlled, inherited, even bequeathed moving forward. And in a digital world, the act of changing the state from 0 to 1 and 1 to 0, owned and managed by individuals, whether it's your capturing track changes in Word or it's your DNA being sequenced, those are data that eventually someone's going to have an interest in and has some value. So it becomes a capital of sorts that should be owned by an individual. It is driving the development of technology to manage consent for the use or digital rights on derivative quantities, and that requires some kind of provenance, some kind of tracking. It's like the music industry, but it's actually going very wide. And we need to think about what this means from a healthcare perspective, but also from a broad industry perspective. And a lot of us focus on privacy now, because the first thing you think about is all this data, is you think about privacy. But I like to double click on privacy and break it into two parts: security and consent. And privacy has become hugely interesting, everybody, because the dramatic drop in the cost of all forms of measurements, photo, metadata collection, genomics, as well as our ability to rapidly communicate, aggregate, and do real-time analysis with ways that are using computers themselves, of course, but would far exceed a human's ability to mine through this data. And this is now resulting in increased concern about privacy loss. Substantial investments in the development of security technologies have been put in place to prevent access to digital systems and the digital content that's contained within them. But when it comes to privacy, security is only half of the story. The second half is consent. In many ways, privacy equals security plus consent. That is, having your data secure does not assure it is only used for what you had consented. I introduced the concept of data governance technologies, and data governance technologies use digital capabilities to manage the consent or rights associated with that data and its derivatives. And these technologies will transform the world. We already know, for example, as individuals, the concerns we have with large organizations aggregating data. And this article highlighting the linkage between Google and Ascension Health using the HIPAA-based approaches to sharing data in healthcare. And the question is it right? Legally, the information gathered by Google can be used for purposes beyond diagnosing illness under the laws enacted during the dial-up era. And the US federal privacy laws make it possible for healthcare providers with little or no input from patients to share data with certain outside companies. That's the structure of HIPAA. If you look at HIPAA, signed into law by Bill Clinton several years ago, focused on health insurance portability and accountability. Nothing to do with the data that we think of now in a data economy generated by passing and by the passage of time in our lives. And we're seeing more and more of this use of the HIPAA structure to start to share data across different industries and different organizations to potentially generate valuable technologies. The reality is that, healthcare data generation is going to be democratized. It's going to be put into the hands of many individuals. Internet of Things devices, Fitbits, and others will start to stream as much data to the process of living as we collect in the process of healthcare. And increasingly, data is being generated by individuals, of individuals, and even funded by individuals. And so how is this data going to move towards a benefit for those individuals or for society at large? Really interestingly, although quite buried in the COVID activity, was in March 19th, the HHS, Human Health Services of the federal government, finalized historic rules that allow patients to have more control of their health data, requiring different EMRs and hospitals to allow patients to extract their information for their own use. It was remarkable to see some of the EMR companies raising concerns in terms of the appropriateness of this, but this law has progressed and has to be implemented by November of this year, really giving individuals the right to have full control of their healthcare data. In the scientific community, we want to have open data so we can share information, so we can learn more quickly. And this kind of a dialogue from the University College London: who owns the data? Open data for healthcare. How do we open up healthcare data? There's the public and citizen engagement approach. We've got to have clarity and transparency. Do we need new regulatory frameworks, new data structures and big data analytics to support it, training and education? And furthermore, Wilkinson's paper on FAIR, the FAIR data principles, the findability, the accessibility, the interoperability, and reusability, contemplate this idea that you're going to put data out there. We have to know where it came from to find it. But who said you could put it out there? What's the mechanism to give us confidence that not just the security questions are addressed, but the consent or the rights to use the data for what you consented for are actually tracked and in place? It's a bit of a paradox, actually. Can you imagine having a governance framework that actually results in the liberation of data for defined and appropriate use? From a healthcare perspective, my role in the hospital, I really oversee the IT systems and the data. I see the ability to have precision in data governance having huge value, enabling open science, better operational collaborations, less risk. Cybersecurity-wise, I know which data is important. I know which has to be protected if it's well governed. But most importantly, and I think this is the really interesting part, is that the patient should be participating fully. And there's organizations like the Unpatient, where Health Data Ownership Manifesto is described. And in fact, an article in Nature and Biotechnology recruited some 11,000 patients into a Parkinson's study in a period of only 3 months, because those individuals were contacted directly by the researchers and they were interested in participating. So there is an opportunity with the right mechanisms to actually liberate data for defined and appropriate use. This is a recent article from Wired, September 30 this year, highlighting how Taiwan's digital minister actually had a huge impact on Taiwan's ability to crush COVID-19. And it was around trust. And I really like her quote after being interviewed and highlighting that only 150 people in Taiwan have contracted the virus, and only 7 have passed compared to statistics from around the rest of the world. She says, when it comes to figuring out how to manage data well, it looks like a trade-off, but it's only a trade-off if you do not innovate. I love that quote. So what is the impact of data governance technologies? And we're going to talk about that in this panel. It could assure privacy. Yes, data governance technologies will work to assure the trust of individuals and the use of digital systems for societal benefit, and work to mitigate concerns of mass monitoring. That's going to be huge. In science and research, robust consent technologies for individual participants as a researcher or as a contributor, consent to access data for a noble purpose, like finding a cure to a rare cancer, something that we're very interested in, could be profound. It could even go further. It could have implications for global inequities and personal wealth development. Maybe you should get IP rights for every one of those characters you changed in that Word document when you worked for that company or when you were writing your thesis. That's powerful. And a social contract with the creation of a new global standard for the human right to create, manage, and trade in the data economy will serve as a fundamental right to privacy and self-determination that is, I believe, central to human advancement. Could be profound. We've assembled a really great panel of individuals here this morning to talk about this. I'm going to introduce each one of them, and then in the same order, they're going to give a perspective on how they see data governance and the technologies associated with it affecting the work they do. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Caroline Chung. Dr. Chung is an associate professor in radiation oncology and diagnostic imaging. She directs an imaging and innovation program in radiation oncology, co-directs a quantitative approach to measuring tumor response using imaging, and has recently taken on the co-chair of the data governance program at the MD Anderson Cancer Center. We're also fortunate to be joined by Andre Dekker, calling in from Maastricht in the Netherlands. Andre is a medical physicist, a professor of clinical data science, and he works on a number of topics, including figuring out how to learn from data where it is, all over the planet, not move the data, move the computation and get the combined insight. We also are joined by Raghu Ramakrishnan, Chief Technology for Data, Technical Fellow, Cloud and AI, the C and AI division of Microsoft. Raghu's background started in the academic domain, working in novel approaches in data management and databases, then worked at Yahoo, and then was recruited to Microsoft to start to drive novel approaches to handle data governance and the like, in particular GDPR. We're also joined by Maria Chatso Dunford. Maria spoke earlier. She holds a PhD in biomedicine and master's in bioinformatics, and she's done a great amount of work to develop new technologies in her companies, you heard earlier in the meeting, to try to manage data in the healthcare domain. I'd like to invite each of the panelists to just give a perspective on what I said. You can disagree. I'm hoping you will. I always like a good debate and conversation. So, Dr. Chung.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a hot topic. From my perspective, in terms of an large academic healthcare institution, I think that the first piece that we've tried to tackle is reshaping the definition of data governance. I think there's been a lot of conversation around access and control and permissions and making it a top-down, so sort of someone's telling you that you can't do something, and that's sort of what we know of data governance as researchers as we try to access data, and you're told you can't do this, that, and the other. And I think that one of the things that we've tried to empower our researchers, our patients, as well as all of our faculty and the multidisciplinary team, and growing that multidisciplinary team is truly the education around all the aspects of data governance. And so when we talk about data governance technology, as David mentioned, it's not just about security and locking things down. It's about tracking the provenance appropriately. It's about evaluating the quality of that data. It's about mapping the ontology so that we actually can understand each other. We can generate transparency, creating that transparency and the clear definitions of what we are dealing with, and having people appreciate the value of that provenance and the quality of the data that lead to the insights that we're all after. Because the true value of this data are the insights that we gather. Having data sit in a commons does not really get us anything. It's not the value of the data. It's what we glean out of that data that is the true value. And for us to actually realize that, we've got to incorporate all of the aspects of data governance. And once we have all of that mapped out and we start talking about it and educating it, we can start building the technology, because if we don't have all the pieces transparently stated out, we don't have the rules by which we're going to use this data or how we're going to build the technologies to do what we intend it to do, it's all of a pipe dream in a way. And I think that we're going back to very manual, human opinionated pieces that lead back to sort of these governing rules that say you can't do this and you can't do that. And so we're trying to break down those barriers by increasing the education as well as the communication with our entire institution. And as I said about growing that multidisciplinary team, it's not just empowering and informing our faculty. We're working very closely with our IT teams. We're working very closely with our data science teams, so that we're all starting to speak the same language, and we're all starting to understand where we're coming from when it comes to data.
That was great. So it's very interesting. The way I think of it now, you're talking about it's like a supply chain of sorts from a data economy, from one end to the other. That's very, very thoughtful. Andre, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I'm a European, so I bear the full brunt of GDPR, and what's interesting about that law is, I think in contrast to some of the things that you said, is that the law was in this case ahead of the technology, right? So the GDPR talks about, okay, anything we do with data has to be lawful and fair and transparent, and you have to limit your purpose, you have to minimize your data, you have to make sure data is accurate, you have to limit the storage, it has to be secure, that's just one of them, just one of almost 14 principles, and you have to be accountable. And also what the GDPR did is establish these individual rights that you talk about, David, which is the right to be informed what happens to your data, the right to access, the right to be forgotten or erased, right? The right to be rectified, but also the right of data portability. So the GDPR gives you the right to, if I store as a hospital data on you, you have the right to get that data out of the hospital in a structured manner. And you have to have the right to object, so consent. And you have to know when they do automatic decision making. So all these rights that the GDPR defined make every single hospital in Europe now breaking the law. Because we cannot do that. We have no way of giving people access to their data or to consent or to give the data away in a structured manner. We still use faxes, as does 80% of US healthcare, right? The NHS just banned faxes in April, but they couldn't manage, so they still use fax for data exchange. So I think what we're seeing from the European side is that we desperately need data governance technologies, especially to establish these very, as you say, fundamental rights that we have now defined, which is very close to the On-Patient initiative, where people themselves take control of their data, and we as healthcare have to have the technologies to do so. So I'm very happy to enter the discussion because there's a real need, at least on our side of the Atlantic.
Good. Love to have multiple perspectives here. Okay, Raghu, what do you think, coming from your academic roots and then into industry? What are your thoughts?
So going back to the time I taught databases, I explained governance in terms of the capability you had in a database management system. And then when I came to Microsoft and got involved in making us compliant with GDPR, talk about bearing the brunt, Andre, I realized something very scary. The data we are talking about is no longer in one database. It's all over the map, okay? And if you notice, when you say privacy equals security plus consent, there are no footnotes that say with the exception of these sources that are painful to govern. That is an assertion about all the data that pertains to an individual that you're making any use of. And as Caroline said, data by itself is not particularly interesting. It's when you start making use of it to improve something, to gain insights, that it becomes valuable. So put those two together. When Microsoft shows you an ad when you're browsing or when you're searching, that's based on things we gather about you, including your search history, your browsing history. And now by GDPR, you can come in and say, I don't like the fact that you know my search history. Forget me. Forget that. That's a data subject request. And we are obligated to remove not only the search history, but the ads that depend on that search history because it's derived from that search history. And the European Union, God bless them, basically said your penalty is up to 10% of your global revenue. And for a company like Microsoft, that's in the billions. And our lawyers are very conservative. So what that meant was we were in for nearly 3 years of conniptions, working ground up all the way to Satya's level, working to get in compliance. Because the bottom line is there are two tectonic forces colliding. On the one hand, your data now sprawls across file systems, data repositories, databases, on-prem, in multiple clouds, and across this, you need to govern holistically. When I say that I give you consent to do this, but not that, you must respect that no matter where my data is and how it travels across your data estate, okay? And the second tectonic force is, in addition to the complexity because of the sprawl in the data, the bar, the regulatory bar, GDPR being one of many examples worldwide, Canada, Australia, California, all over the place, there are similar rules. That bar is rising. So it's no longer optional. As Andre and others have said, If you can't comply, your only option is not to make use of the data. And that's not a good option. So I'm a technologist in my role here, building the infrastructure to make it possible to formulate and enforce appropriate governance policies. What are those appropriate policies? That's up to all of us as a society to think through, because data is probably your most personal asset today. Everything about you is describable through that lens.
That's amazing, Raghu. Really interesting perspective. I love the pressure that we're putting the technology under, and then how do we get people to, use that technology? Maria, please join us, CEO, co-founder, Lifebit, Biotech. Jump into this conversation.
Thank you, everyone. So I think I have very little things to add here. I think most of the people covered quite a lot of the topics. But going back to Caroline's point, the data usability is maybe the #1 key. We've never have been in an era where we are generating so much data, yet so little of it is actually being utilized, right? And there are statistics that showing that anywhere between 1 to 5% of all of big data out there is actually properly utilized, right? And those statistics change from maybe a field to a field, but that's sort of like an average. So that's one big groundbreaking statistics. The other big problem is, like, especially when we look at healthcare data, which is where my expertise lies, when we look clinical data by themselves or genomic data by themselves, normally it's not that deep insights that you can extract. Now, when you combine them, now we're talking about exponential insights, right? And we've seen that again and again, where it has been demonstrated through different studies that for any data that grow by 10x, we normally get 100x sort of like discoveries coming out of that. So then the big challenge becomes, how do we increase usability? How do we manage to integrate this data? And by integrating now this data, the thing that you cause is what we call the re-identification risks. Obviously, because the more I link more and more data and integrate it together, it becomes easier to identify individuals. And that is a very, very technical problem to solve, almost impossible, pretty much. And on the other hand, like even from a regulation standpoint, we still do not have enough regulation covering those things, right? So that's one big challenge that we are being faced with, especially because we come at the field and we work with some of the world's biggest biobanks, including Genomics England and governments out there, where literally our job is to do exactly that, integrate vast amounts of genomics, different multi-omics data with clinical and phenotypic data. And then at the end of the day, the expectation is that no one should be able to re-identify anyone. The other big thing also to mention here is that, and we still do not have, we're talking about individuals having the right to own their data and use this data. But what happens with the population rights, right? Like as a government and with COVID-19, creating all of this big mess, if you like, in so many areas, right? Like what happens with the rights for a government to say, okay, I need to be able to use this data to respond fast to what is a global epidemic, what is literally killing people. I think, again, we do not have that much regulation there. We do not know. We know now, at least from the UK perspective, the UK government issue a completely new governance policy, if you like, where they completely outline their healthcare strategy moving forward and how they're going to be doing things. But still, there is not enough regulation about how these data are going to be coming together, what will it mean for the use, and so on and so forth. So I think those are the three types of insights, I think, that we, on the day-to-day, on the front lines, we struggle quite a bit. Okay,
that was fantastic. We're getting some questions in the chat already, but I think we did the slides off. That's good. We have a couple other questions that the panel has been kind of exposed to in advance, and maybe I'll throw to Andre on some of his thoughts around, what's the appetite for people to start to sort of manage this data onto their own, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, it's not easy, because if you ask people to manage their own data, as Raghu said, this is quite very bright minds don't even know how to do it, let alone the average citizen. And so I think much like, clicking away your cookies, as we all do, at least in Europe, not sure how it is in the US, we are a bit afraid that people will click away their genetic data as well, just as easily, because they don't want to be bothered and they really don't perhaps grasp what they're doing there. On the other hand, there is certainly in the rare diseases that's coming up a clear vision that we should share way more data than we do now, because the value of data is so important. And these people are generally very well invested into their own data and making sure that that's available. So we have these contracting balances where especially patients have a great need to share data and also are very altruistic, whereas the average citizen is very much against it, and public opinion is making it difficult. And I think this is where we need a new social discussion where rather than just focusing on securing data or being conservative about it, we should open up the way to discuss the value. And I always give the example in the Netherlands, nobody has yet died of a privacy breach, whereas many people have died because data has not been available. So what are we doing here? I mean, when did privacy become such an important thing in Europe that we now say this is more important than sharing data to save people's lives? It's kind of a weird hole that we got ourselves into.
Sorry, I just lost audio for some reason. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, great. I think this is the education question, and I'm going to throw it back to Caroline because she talked about this initially. How do we get people oriented? I mean, at the individual, of course, that's one part of the conversation as a citizen, so to say. But even in the academic setting, the scientists and the researchers, getting them oriented. And in fact, there's a question in the chat line asking more about what Dr. Chung said regarding how do we go about orienting and educating? Can you do it without the tools? Do you kind of need the tools at the same time? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Andre. I think that even those of us who have been sitting here for a long time thinking about data, if we were to be asked about what we're going to do with our own data, I don't know if we necessarily, each of us, have a very clear answer of how we want to treat our own data. And I think that there's a lot of aspects of the data that people are not necessarily appreciating. So there's been discussion around transformations or derivative data. So, the data in itself, most people think of data as this one piece of information about you, but it's connected to a lot of other things. And those other things is what connects it back to identify it to you. And so I think that that's the provenance and the lineage of that data. And so starting to really appreciate those nuanced pieces of that data and educating that is not an easy thing. One of the things that we've tried to do is incorporate any of the technologies that people are interacting with and providing definitions up front. For instance, we've just been reviewing how do we actually demonstrate provenance of that data. And for the first time, people are coming to something like a dashboard or a summary table, and they're seeing, here is the provenance of this data. And all of a sudden, people are asking the question, where did this data come from? Whereas prior to seeing that, they would have taken the data and they say, here it is, I'm going to go and run off with it and analyze it because it's available. And so I think starting to have that dialogue and realizing that knowing where that data has come from or who has touched that data is really key to actually making sure that your insights are really sound and robust. In terms of how, there's a follow-up question around that education piece. We've really used that provenance tracking in terms of attribution. And so how can we reimagine attribution to encourage academics to share data, or even their patients to share data? I think it really comes back to the provenance tracking. So as the data moves through, as the derivatives are formed, as the transformations are created, who has contributed to that, and being able to track that is really key. How we actually represent that at the final outset, whether it's a team authorship that could be in the academic setting, or it could be making sure that if you've contributed X% effort to the total effort of that, project, that you would be included in the authorship. I think that those are the aspects, those are the nuances and the social constructs that each institution or each organization will need to find out for themselves. But I think the first key step in terms of the technology is the capability to track the provenance.
Yeah, that's fantastic comments. Raghu, when you finally got Azure GDPR compliant, did you put all these pieces in place? Like how maybe it's too much of a detailed question, but how do you make that work at scale? Is it a computational feasible task?
It's feasible. It also takes a lot of effort. Our scales, as you know, David, are in the exabytes. Every day, Microsoft, for our analytics, we read and write on the order of multiple exabytes. That's just what we read and write every day. The total amount of data is in double-digit exabytes. There are thousands of people accessing this. At those scales, you need automated ways of enforcing any policy. And as has come up repeatedly, provenance, tracking data over its journey, all the way from a click in your search history to an ad based on a profile, based on that search history, it needs to be robust. And along the way, you need to make sure that numerous rules, the lifetime you're allowed to retain certain data, who's allowed to view that data for what purpose, all of these myriad subsidiary regulations are satisfied. So yes, we invested nearly 3 years of energy into building the underlying platform capabilities as well as using them to make Microsoft GDPR. And that brings me to a point I want to make. As data becomes central to our decisions in healthcare and other industries, the bar, when I say I have provenance from this piece of data to that, how much can I stand behind it? Could someone have tampered with it, right? Is this auditable? Is it tamper-proof? The bar goes higher and higher. Can I track provenance across 5 different analytic tools that I'm using? As it moves from where the data is collected to where it's analyzed, to where the machine learned model based on that analysis is deployed and a decision made, right? The meta point I want to make is we should be mindful that we are in the midst truly of a revolution with at least 2 tracks. One track is, what is the ethics of data and data sharing? To Andre's point, people are dying. We are concerned about privacy. And as good academics, we are concerned about authorship and credit, all right? All of these, and I won't try to priority rank those concerns. These are one track, which is about what is right use of data, right? As a society, we need to think through the appropriate policies and agree upon them. The other track, more mundane, but essential if you have to be successful in actually operationalizing any policy emerging from the first track. How do you make it possible for someone who's the CIO of an organization like MD Anderson to put in place the controls to ensure that you're compliant with whatever policies you have internally, as well as any external regulations you need to comply with? And frankly, that is in flux as well. The old world of data governance comes packaged with your database is no longer valid. And we are still figuring out how to put the pieces together so that what companies like Microsoft have to do for themselves from the ground up, you can now make it available for others to use, hopefully with less effort, but that's a journey.
No, it's really good points, Raghu. And I just think about how the database was the data governance architecture of the past. It's my database, it's in my PC underneath my desk, it's governed. I don't have any problem. But as we start to want to connect to get more value, it really reinforces the need. And I just think about the sort of paradigm around sharing. We've had financial constructs so we can have people donate money. They still have donated from a bank account. It's not just like they put it out in the street. There's still a structure. So from a data economy perspective, we need the resolution and then the details as well. Maria, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the structures, and if you're being challenged to bring this data together, what are you seeing as opportunities, or are people willing to kind of just share? I'm kind of an anti-share person. My mom don't talk about that, but go ahead.
So, I mean, speaking from the front lines of bringing these solutions to life, as we're speaking, we kind of see, you know, there is this tendency to believe that people actually do not want to share their data, but actually when it comes to the practicalities of it, what we see is that people are very much keen to be sharing their data. Namely, this is the reason why big initiatives like the Personal Genome Project has been so successful. And at some point they stopped actually allowing people to donate data, only because they didn't have the funding anymore, right? To actually do all of the sequencing and the system and so on and so forth. And we're working with them. We are actually putting our systems in place to allow access and analysis real time to happen to this data. So there are a lot of people that are ready to share their data, right? And going down to even a genomic level. What we see then, and that's pretty much the on the side of, like, if you like, free folks out there, right, wanting to participate in something. What we now see on the more regulated healthcare system, again, we do actually once more see a lot of people, you know, donating data, their whole clinical medical histories, their genomic data, right? And in the UK, do not forget that it is a centralized healthcare system. So it's not distributed like as distributed as it is in the US, where nothing talks to anything for most parts of it. So it's very easy for this data to actually be connected. But we see the people that are very much keen to do that, right? And they, the way they see it, and there was a big campaign that we were running at some point in the UK, just like you're donating blood, you should be donating data, right? Because data saves lives. And now the concern, though, that these participants and patients have is like the use of this data. They're fine for this data to be used for any clinical purposes, for any purposes that will advance research and discoveries. But of course, they want this data to, they have big concerns around if there is any malicious use of this data, right? And then those changes, it's a big range of like what they are being concerned about. So I think, so what we are trying to do there is to try to put in place systems that can guarantee, right, that, and we always say this, that at least when we are working with a lot of those biobanks and genomic single cell, is much more about the promise that we give to these patients rather than actually having the full regulation that stops us from doing whatever we really want with this data. So yeah, so and then from there, I think back to Raghu's point, like technology-wise, you can do it. Is it difficult? Yes, it's very, very difficult for most parts of it. But can you do it? Yes. And for us, when we got the big project of getting the COVID data, making it available, and we had to be very, very fast with that, right? We were working day and night, right? And it was not just us; it was also AWS along with us. Was the whole team for genomic singular. It was like a big effort trying to get the whole system going. And it's very difficult to go fast and not cut corners, but at the end of the day, you should not be cutting corners. And eventually, the corners that we cut was much more on usability, on having the full scope of all of the data properly analyzed, but we actually doubled down on security, right? We spent more than several of months on security aspects. Now, there was a question about like, how do you incentivize companies, organizations to share data? Well, number one thing is like data cannot move. And I've said this multiple times also during my talk, right? It's naive to believe that data will be moving, right? We cannot be getting data away from, you know, the Anderson Hospital to somewhere else, to someone else, right? Like data needs to stay where it is. So therefore, now you need to be coming up with solutions that can access this data in a secure manner, right? And then not only accessing this data, but then, you know, providing to users interfaces where they can actually very easily query this data, very easily then deploy analysis over this data, very easily visualize this data. I do believe if we can create these systems and go to organizations and say like, look, we can do this, then I honestly do believe, and we see it also from the day-to-day work that we do with all of our clients, there is a big number of organizations that are ready to do it, right? They just need to feel sure that the data is not going to be compromised and it's not going to be going around. Now, are there also organizations like Top Pharma, for example, that would never share big data, and pharmaceutical data? Most probably, but that, I think there we need different types of incentives, I would say. It's not just technological.
Very good point, Maria. And we have 5 minutes left. I think I've hit a nerve with the word share, not sharing. Raghu, I think you were channeling my mom, chastising me for not sharing. So let's have that conversation around sharing. I mean, I'm going to ask everybody, we have 5 minutes left only, which is a shame because it's been such a good conversation. And Maria, you kind of already took us in this direction a bit. I mean, sharing is just such a fuzzy thing. I mean, I think you want to be explicit at what you're doing with data. And so I'm going to let each of the panelists, I mean, Andre, then Caroline and Raghu, pick up on this sort of sharing conversation. Andre.
Yeah, so I agree with you that sharing is not the right angle, right? We shouldn't even talk about data, to be honest, that's also a wrong angle for me. The whole angle should be, okay, what do you do? What's the question? You know, what's the use? I mean, that's where you want to, that's what you want to understand. And that's also perhaps what you want to govern, right? How do you use the data? And then it doesn't, you know, if there is a very specific and very good use case to share data, like in Taiwan with COVID-19, right? Then fine, you know, move the data to a central location at the government if you trust the government and deal with that. But if the question is perhaps less important because it's, I don't know, Google trying to do something with your data, then perhaps you look at it very differently. So I think we should focus a little bit more on the question or the use of data and less on the data itself. You're muted, David.
I get in more trouble when using the word sharing. Like, I do like to share, okay, don't get me wrong. I think it's very important, but it's sort of a romantic thing as opposed to something concrete that we can actually build an economy on. Caroline, what are your thoughts on this sort of sharing or not sharing paradigm?
Well, as you know, I like to be precise in my language, so I was going to ask you what you're defining when you say sharing. I guess everyone may have slightly different definitions of what they're saying when they're sharing. When you think about the whole sharing is caring, I agree with you that I don't think that won't necessarily help us move forward in any sort of transactional or business contractual sort of agreements. And so I think that if we really want to believe that we want to move this forward in contractual frameworks, whether it be the patient consent, whether it be between institutions or organizations, the word sharing, and I understand your hesitation depending on how you've defined that in your head, that if you think about it from a collegial, friendly, you know, there's very few boundaries of how much data are you going to share. And so I guess I also ask the question of, if we are truly talking about a data economy, we're going to be talking about contractual exchanges of data, not necessarily movement of data, but exchanges of access to data, then I think that we need to start to think about what is that data unit. So what is the unit? What's equivalent to, you know, when we talk about currency, we have different currencies and we've calibrated the currencies against each other around the world. So how do we do that when it comes to data? And I think that we need to start thinking about that if we really mean that we want to start to evolve a data economy.
Really interesting. Raghu, sharing.
Let me begin by first of all saying that I think the whole business of data movement is a red herring. There are some extreme scenarios. You don't want to move data out of a geopolitical boundary because of laws in effect that can be brought to bear or not. Modulo those, I think it's not about moving data, it's about who has access to what data for what purpose. And the who, it can be me sharing with you, David. It can be me sharing with this panel. It can be MD Anderson sharing with, you know, Rice University. Once you start thinking about sharing at all these granularities, I am flabbergasted that there's even any debate about the goodness of sharing data. Yes, there are cases where you have to begin by thinking about the right use and work backwards from that. But there are many cases where you're being exploratory. We are scientists. Most of the time, we are looking at data for that penicillin moment, right? The serendipitous discovery. You have, I don't think, there was a purpose when he saw the fungus. It kind of emerged. How do you enable these kinds of things? I can tell you from the decades of work I've seen at Microsoft, sharing is quintessentially the engine that powers innovation. And you have to think in terms of what data you're sharing with whom, for what purpose, with what safeguards. You need to make this a fundamental starting point in your thinking. And ultimately, there are forms of sharing where, yes, you do need to say this is for this purpose, which is working backwards from a use case, and you're very tight in scoping it. But there's a wide spectrum here.
No, it's really good. We're at 11:56. Are we allowed to keep going, Angela, or is someone going to stop listening to us? I don't know if it would matter. We're just going to keep talking. Go ahead, keep going. Okay, that's great. I mean, there's just so much to talk about. I mean, you brought up the point about who and identity and entity. It's a key part. And so maybe next year when we bring the panel back, Raghu and I met at this panel last year, and it's been fun playing in the conversation and joining in with my other friends we like to chat about these topics with. Maybe we will bring back identity management, because at the end of the day, it's not just a person. It could be a company. It could be a group of people. It could be a whole citizenry of a country that needs an answer to a hard problem. And once we start to think about working those entities for one good or a collective good, I think this is it becomes extremely interesting. But man, we'll need some technology to manage that. Any other closing comments? Anybody? 20 seconds each. Go ahead. Tell us what your closing comments for the panel are. Dr. Chung, you're muted.
I think we have a long road ahead of us. There's a lot to think about here. I think that the big pieces here is understanding the nuances of data governance, and even just what is a data unit, what is data? And as we start to think through that, and as we start to think through, yes, the technologies are there, but how we actually utilize those technologies to empower us is really the key piece. So understanding the nuances of what we mean when we say we're going to share data is more key than actually building out the technologies. I think Raghu can speak to that, we definitely have the technologies and capabilities to do it. It's the way of how we're actually going to utilize the technologies to empower what we're envisioning.
Yeah, it's really strong. Maria.
So maybe on that, a lot of times when we are discussing about data economies, there is a lot of focus going towards like, how can we profit from this data? But there is also the other side of it. What we see constantly from all of our clients that are the data vendors, right? Where they are providing this data either by, like charging for the access to this data or on a pro bono pretty much basis. They are always faced with one challenge. So you can charge for the access, and then maybe that's a one-off cost, but then the people coming accessing this data and now running analysis over this data, keeping this data alive into like storage, right? That's ongoing cost. So how do we, and talking about how we're making data more usable, you need full-blown research environments or digital research environment to be sitting on top of this data that will allow not just access where you can just go download the batch of data that will not even fit any computer that we have right now, like actually be able to do analysis with it, right? That's ongoing cost. How do we recuperate those costs? That's one of the big problems that it is very much unsolved. The Lifebit is which I guess that's why we're in business. We're providing a really, really good solution, but I think it's one of the areas where there's still so much to be done about thinking, when we're thinking about how we're making this data usable, also thinking recuperation, cost recuperation models around this data.
Great points. Raghu, then Andre, you got 20 seconds each or so, and we'll wrap up at the top of the hour.
So, to Caroline's comment, I would be hesitant to claim that we have the technology to do everything we need to. If anyone tells you that, don't believe them. None of us do. We are working towards raising the bar. It's a journey. And to be honest, this track, the technology will get good enough. We'll get there. I'm confident. But the thing that I think is truly a journey in front of us collectively is the ethics of managing data in a responsible manner, right? The truth is, the information about us out there in terms of data from various sources, it's a far bigger amount, a far bigger visibility to our most private selves. Everything about our health, our finances, whatever you want to think about, than anything in the history of mankind. And all this, a man's home is his castle. Forget that nonsense. Your data is your castle. And we need to think collectively and responsibly about what protections we want to put in place. And this is going to be by far the harder journey.
Great comments. Okay, Andre, bring us home from Europe.
Yeah, let me echo Raghu's point, is that once we have the technology, we're going to have a much more tougher discussion and talk about what do we really want now. And I think that is pretty unclear. We don't want the current situation where we give all our data away, and we don't know it, but we get it, the data is monetized via advertisement. I don't think we want that in healthcare. But what do we want else? That is going to be the question. And then the subsequent question is going to be, who will pay for that? Because this data may be the new oil, but the oil is in the ground. We don't have technology to get it out, and we don't have technology to understand what do we do when we get it out. So still a bit to do.
Yeah, no, I love it. I really love it. Your data is your castle. That's very interesting comments. Lots to learn. Fantastic conversation by everybody. I'd like to thank Angela for helping us in the background, dealing with many comments that came through in the chat line. And I'd like to thank each of our presenters and Michelle magically helping us as well in the process. So with that, we'll close the panel. Is that correct, Angela?
Yes, and thank you everybody for being here. I agree, we should probably do this next year. Hopefully, maybe we can do some of it in person. But thank you all so much. It was a very interesting discussion.
Thanks, Angela. Thanks, David. Thanks all.
Thanks, you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Angela. Bye.